A relentless wave of Ukrainian long-range drone and missile strikes has plunged major Russian population centers into an unprecedented state of infrastructural collapse, triggering a cascading humanitarian disaster as winter tightens its grip. Cities across western and central Russia, including regional capitals critical to the nation's energy grid, have been darkened by widespread power outages, severed from natural gas supplies, and are now grappling with burst pipelines and localized flooding. The coordinated attacks, targeting electrical substations, generating plants, and key pipeline pressure stations, have left millions without heat, light, or running water during the deepest freeze of the season. Social media channels and intercepted communications paint a dire picture of civilian desperation. Hospitals operating on backup generators with dwindling fuel, residents burning furniture for warmth, and a growing exodus from urban areas as the systemic failure compounds. This is not merely a tactical bombardment, it is a strategic campaign aimed at the very lifelines of Russian domestic comfort, challenging the Kremlin's long-held promise of stability behind the front lines and exposing critical vulnerabilities in national defense planning. The immediate physical chaos: transformer explosions lighting up the night sky, water mains erupting from frozen pipes, streets flooded with icy water, is rapidly evolving into a severe political and social crisis for the Russian state. The scale of the disruption is vast, with impacts felt from Bryansk and Belgorod near the Ukrainian border to more distant locales like Smolensk and even peripheries of the Moscow region. Initial reports from Russian regional authorities, often fragmented and delayed, acknowledge emergency situations at multiple energy facilities, but consistently understate the human toll. Independent analysis of satellite imagery and power grid data, however, confirms the simultaneous failure of at least a dozen major substations and the forced shutdown of 2 gas compressor stations along the Yamal-Europe pipeline corridor. The attacks employed a sophisticated mix of decoy drones and advanced missiles, some adapted from Western-supplied components, designed to overwhelm and bypass Russian air defenses. The resulting blackouts are not rotational, they are total and prolonged. Without electricity, pumping stations for water and gas have ceased operation, leading to a rapid drop in pressure in distribution networks. As temperatures plummet well below 0 Celsius, this stagnant water within pipes has frozen, expanding and cracking aged Soviet-era infrastructure. Subsequent thaws in some areas, or firefighting efforts, have then led to bursts and widespread flooding, compounding the misery with water damage and ice-glazed streets. The timing of the offensive is strategically acute, leveraging the inherent fragility of Russia's often overlooked domestic infrastructure during peak winter demand. Beyond the immediate humanitarian emergency, the strikes have illuminated a profound strategic shift in Kyiv's war planning. After enduring months of relentless attacks on its own energy grid, Ukraine has demonstrated a developing capability to reciprocate on a scale that inflicts not just symbolic pain but tangible, systemic disruption. This represents a move from targeting purely military or symbolic sites to targeting the integrated network that sustains modern urban life in Russia. The global implication is immediate. It demonstrates that non-NATO states can develop and deploy asymmetric deep strike capabilities that threaten a major power's homeland resilience. For Europe and the world, the crisis underscores the interconnectedness of energy security and conflict, with the attacks on pipeline infrastructure sending subtle tremors through global energy markets despite sanctions as traders assess the stability of Russia's once vaunted export network. Historically, the vulnerability of centralized energy systems to targeted strikes has been a subject of military theory, but rarely executed on such a scale against a nuclear power during an active conflict. The current situation echoes the Allied bombing campaigns against German industrial infrastructure in World War II, but is executed with far more precision and at a fraction of the cost. It also inverts the narrative of the early winter of 2022, when Russia attempted to break Ukrainian resolve through mass strikes on heating and power plants. Now, that same tactic is being reflected back, testing the social contract between the Russian state and its citizens. The historical context of Russia's own infrastructure decay is crucial. Decades of underinvestment in maintenance and modernization, coupled with the drain of resources and expertise toward the war effort, have left the system inherently brittle. The Ukrainian strikes did not create this weakness but have exploited it with devastating effectiveness. Politically, the infrastructure collapse presents the Kremlin with its most severe domestic challenge since the outbreak of full-scale war. The core bargain of President Vladimir Putin's rule, political quiescence in exchange for material stability and rising living standards, is being violently ruptured. The sight of darkened cities and freezing apartments in the Russian heartland fundamentally undermines the messaging that life continues normally despite the special military operation. Local officials are facing public fury, while federal authorities vacillate between blaming Ukrainian terrorists and accusing sabotage or negligence, a sign of internal discord over responsibility. The narrative of an impermeable homeland shield has been shattered, raising urgent questions about the competency of the Defense Ministry and security services. Furthermore, these events empower hardline factions within the Russian security apparatus who may argue for even more brutal escalation against Ukrainian cities, potentially risking further international isolation. Conversely, it may also fuel discreet discussions among elites about the long-term sustainability of a war that is now visibly rebounding onto Russian soil in a profoundly disruptive way. The social consequences are unfolding in real time. The initial shock has given way to a grim struggle for survival. In affected cities, a black market for gasoline-powered generators and bottled water has exploded, pricing out ordinary citizens. Community aid groups, some operating in a legal gray area, have sprung up to distribute blankets and food, often filling voids left by slow-moving state emergency services. The psychological impact is profound, replacing a sense of detached security with one of acute vulnerability. The desire to leave is palpable, with reports of increased railway bookings to southern regions and a surge in online searches for real estate in unaffected areas. This internal displacement, if it grows, could strain resources in other cities and create a new class of internal refugees, a phenomenon Russia has not faced in modern times. The economic impact extends beyond the immediate crisis. Prolonged power downtime is forcing the closure of factories, warehouses, and commercial businesses, not directly related to the war industry, leading to lost productivity and wages. Insurance claims are set to skyrocket, burdening the financial sector. The cost of repairs will be astronomical, requiring the diversion of materials, labor, and capital from other projects, including potentially military production. This imposes a stealth tax on the Russian economy, already under severe strain from sanctions and the demands of prolonged conflict. The damage to the domestic gas distribution network may also have a knock-on effect on Russia's ability to maintain pressure and flow in its export pipelines, a technical issue that could concern remaining international buyers. International reactions have been sharply divided. Ukrainian officials have maintained strategic ambiguity, rarely claiming direct responsibility for strikes deep inside Russia, but emphasizing the right to target all infrastructure used to support the war machine. Western nations have been cautiously silent on the operational details, focusing public statements on Ukraine's right to self-defense while privately assessing the strategic implications. Analysts note that the demonstrated range and precision of these attacks likely involve Western intelligence and technological enabling, a fact that Moscow will seize upon to accuse NATO of direct involvement. Chinese state media has reported on the humanitarian situation with unusual prominence, hinting at concern over regional stability. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Russian diplomats are preparing to demand emergency sessions, framing the attacks as war crimes against civilian infrastructure, a move likely to be countered by Ukrainian and Western presentations of identical Russian tactics over the past 2 winters. The coming days will be critical in determining whether Russian civil defense and repair crews can restore minimal services before public desperation boils over. The weather forecast promises continued sub-zero temperatures with no respite. Military analysts anticipate that Russia will likely respond with a massive new barrage against Ukrainian energy targets, but Ukraine, having endured and adapted to such attacks, may be better prepared for a renewed attritional battle of grids. The resilience of Russian public morale is now a key variable. Sustained hardship could lead to rare public protests or, more likely, a deepening apathy and private grievance that erodes the war's perceived legitimacy from within. The infrastructure war has entered a new and more dangerous phase, where the front line is no longer defined solely by trenches but by transformers, pipelines, and the freezing homes of millions. The long-term consequences of this infrastructural breakdown will resonate far beyond the immediate winter crisis, potentially altering the domestic political landscape and the fundamental calculus of the war. Expert analysis suggests that the Ukrainian military, advised by Western strategists, has executed a campaign modeled on effects-based operations where the goal is not territorial capture but the inducement of systemic collapse within an adversary's society. The chosen targets, voltage transformers, gas compressor stations, and key switching hubs are not easily replaced. Many of these components were manufactured in specialized Western or Ukrainian plants, now closed to Russia, subject to international sanctions. The domestic Russian industry, hampered by technological embargoes, struggles to produce equivalents at the required scale and speed. This means that repairs may be patchwork, involving cannibalizing parts from less critical regions, leading to a degraded national grid capacity for years to come. The economic historian's perspective reveals that Russia is now forced to allocate scarce capital not toward future growth or even war production, but toward the recreation of a baseline that existed just weeks ago. This represents a massive diversion of national wealth into a sinkhole of reconstruction, all while oil and gas revenues remain constrained by price caps and export limitations. The social fabric in the affected regions is undergoing a severe stress test. The phenomenon of internal displacement is accelerating, not as a state-managed evacuation but as a haphazard, individual scramble for survival. Railway stations in cities like Voronezh and Tula report overcrowding, with families hauling suitcases toward the perceived safety of the south or the comparative stability of St. Petersburg. This movement creates its own logistical and humanitarian challenges, straining the resources of host communities and leading to potential social friction. Within the darkened cities, a shift in authority is subtly occurring. The state's inability to provide the most basic services, heat and light, has eroded its monopoly on governance. Informal networks, local volunteers, and even criminal groups are stepping into the void, distributing aid, providing security for functioning stores, or selling contraband fuel at exorbitant prices. This fragmentation of control, even if temporary, could leave a lasting impression on the populace's relationship with central authority. The psychological impact is multifaceted. Alongside anger and fear, there is a growing sense of abandonment, a realization that the state's vast military resources and security apparatus cannot protect its own core infrastructure. This disillusionment is more dangerous to the regime than overt protest, as it corrodes legitimacy from within, fostering passive resistance and a retreat into private survivalism. Internationally, the crisis has forced a recalibration of positions. For Ukraine's allies, the strikes present a moral and strategic dilemma. Publicly, officials reiterate that Ukraine is defending itself with weapons provided for that purpose. Privately, there is intense debate over the escalation risks of enabling deep strikes on civilian-adjacent infrastructure, even as those same allies have condemned identical Russian tactics. The demonstrated effectiveness of these attacks, however, bolsters the argument that supporting Ukraine's long-range capabilities is a militarily decisive investment. For nations of the global south, the imagery of freezing Russian cities serves as a potent reminder of war's diffuse and unpredictable consequences, potentially strengthening calls for negotiated solutions. China, Russia's strategic partner, faces a particular quandary. Beijing's stance of no-limits friendship is tested by the prospect of a destabilized, economically weakened partner requiring massive support, and by the uncomfortable demonstration of how a smaller nation's precision strikes can humiliate a major military power. Chinese commentary has begun to subtly emphasize the importance of protecting civilian infrastructure, a message directed at all parties but clearly acknowledging the new reality on the ground. From a military strategic standpoint, the Ukrainian campaign forces a fundamental rethink of homeland defense in the age of proliferated drone technology. strategy. Russia's layered air defenses, concentrated around Moscow and critical military sites, proved inadequate against a swarm of low-cost, slow-flying drones attacking from multiple vectors and targeting the less guarded periphery of the energy network. This failure will be studied globally by both state and non-state actors, illustrating that critical national infrastructure is inherently vulnerable to saturation attacks. The Russian military must now decide whether to further deplete its finite stockpiles of surface-to-air missiles by repositioning them to defend every substation and pipeline node across a vast territory, a tactically impossible and resource-draining endeavor. Alternatively, it may opt for offensive suppression, launching even more intense campaigns to destroy Ukrainian launch sites and production facilities, a task that has so far proven elusive. The battlefield has been exponentially expanded, stretching Russian defensive and logistical resources thinner than at any previous point in the conflict. The environmental and public health ramifications are only beginning to emerge. Burst water mains have contaminated supplies and flooded streets that have now frozen into sheets of ice, hampering emergency vehicle movement and causing a spike in injuries. The lack of wastewater treatment due to power failures raises the specter of disease outbreaks. Residents burning wood, plastic, and anything else combustible for heat are degrading air quality in urban centers, a severe risk for those with respiratory conditions. Hospitals, running on backup generators, have postponed non-critical surgeries and are struggling to maintain sterile environments and refrigerate medicines. The cumulative effect is a public health crisis unfolding in slow motion, whose full toll may not be known for months. This secondary catastrophe further burdens local governments already overwhelmed by the primary task of restoring energy. Looking ahead, the trajectory points toward an intensified phase of mutual infrastructural targeting. Russia possesses a larger, though not inexhaustible, stockpile of missiles and drones for continued strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities. Ukraine, having demonstrated this new capability, is likely to continue and refine its campaign, seeking to keep pressure on the Russian system and force the diversion of military resources to defensive homeland duties. The coming weeks will be a race between Russian repair crews and the next wave of Ukrainian strikes, between the speed of social adaptation and the breaking point of civilian endurance. The potential for miscalculation is high. A particularly devastating strike that causes mass civilian casualties could trigger a disproportionate Russian response, potentially involving tactical nuclear threats or direct strikes on decision-making centers in Kyiv. Conversely, a total collapse of services in a major Russian city could force the Kremlin to consider drastic measures, such as declaring a state of emergency in unaffected regions to commandeer resources, or secretly pursuing temporary ceasefire arrangements to enable repairs. Ultimately, this episode marks a pivotal moment in the conflict's evolution. It has shattered the illusion of sanctuary, demonstrating that the war's consequences are inescapable and reciprocal. The conflict is no longer contained at the front lines or even limited to military targets. It is now a total contest of societal resilience. The freezing darkness enveloping Russian cities is more than a humanitarian disaster. It is a strategic signal that the price of this war, once thought exportable solely to Ukraine, has now come due at home. The decisions made in the Kremlin, in Ukrainian command centers, and in Western capitals in response to this new reality will determine whether the conflict spirals into an even more dangerous and destructive phase or creates the perverse conditions for a stalemate where both sides, profoundly wounded at home, seek an exit from the mutual ruin. The infrastructure war has begun, and its battles are fought in kilovolts and cubic meters of gas, its casualties measured in degrees of Celsius, and the fading patience of a population pushed to its limit.